So welcome to native Java REST API comparison. We're going to talk about Micronaut, Quarkus, Spring Boot, and Helidon. My name is Matt Rabel. I'm a hick from the sticks. I grew up in the backwoods of Montana with no electricity, no running water for 16 years, and I did have to walk 2 miles to the bus stop, and it did feel like it was uphill both ways. The cool thing was in the winter we got to ski. So I actually have a ton of cross-country skiing in that I didn't even realize till I was an adult, right? They talk about like 10,000 hours. I got 10,000 hours of cross-country skiing in just from going to school. I live in Denver, Colorado with my beautiful wife, Trish, and my awesome kids, Abby and Jack. You might notice the hat, CU, University of Colorado, Coach Prime. I'm not only a fan, I'm an investor. Jack is a freshman there, Abby is a junior, and so both of them chose it before Coach Prime decided to go there. So I'm not just fair weather, but you can tell this picture is old because Jack is now 6 inches taller than me, so I need a new photo there. I have a middle child as well. His name is Hefe. I bought him off eBay in 2004, and it took 12 years to make him look like this. Part of the problem was the Porsche engine and the Porsche transmission and the fully custom suspension, but he is sure fun to drive. I just realized I don't have my speaker notes, so I'm going to miss some jokes if I don't do those, so let me get those up here. Oh, what was that trick? I just heard it the other day. Command 8? Oh, yeah, look at that. No, that's to navigate. All right, hold on. There's a setting here where I got to mirror my screen. Great, Matt. Arrange. Don't mirror. Stop mirroring. Okay. Now we can have more jokes. No, you'll see them if I do it that way. Well, you got to do it like this. And then you got to go over here, get your mouse over there, and do that. All right, back in action. All right. I also have a second one because I have such an expensive obsession with Volkswagens. I got tired for the bus to be done because he took 12 years that I bought a camper van. So one of them's named Hefe for Hefeweizen. He's German, right? That's the yellow one. And then we have Stout on the left there. I work at a company called Okta. My dad called it Okra for the first 5 years. Now he's graduated to Okta, so he's still not quite there. But it was interesting to hear Chris's presentation on IDPs because guess what? We're an IDP, but we're an identity provider. So I feel like our IDP has been around longer than the internal development, what was it, console or something? But, oh well. We bought our biggest competitor a few years ago, Auth0, and one of the things I loved was reading their president's or their CEO's bio when I first learned about the acquisition. His name's Eugenio Pace, and it says, in his spare time, he enjoys the outdoors, rowing, riding bikes, spending time with his family, and restoring his 1970 Karmann Ghia, right? That's an old Volkswagen like I have, so I was like, man, this guy and I are going to get along great. I did send him pictures of mine after we won Best of Show at a Colorado show, and he sent me pictures of his, which is just a frame. So he's got a ways to go there. So today we're going to talk about just why Java, because I've done this talk at non-Java places before. I'll show you how to build REST APIs in particular, and then we'll talk a bit about GraphQL APIs. I'll show you how to secure them with OAuth, and then build them with Docker, and go native with GraalVM. So you might be asking, why Java? Well, 25 years of use, abuse, and improvements. It's open source. The code's been available for a long time. Many popular open source projects and tools, and hugely popular with many enterprises and web scale companies. Netflix, eBay, IBM, Microsoft, Okta, VMware, Tesla, Apple, you might have heard of some of those. So to get started with the latest and greatest, you can download Oracle builds of OpenJDK or Eclipse builds from Adoptium. But that's the hard way. The easy way is SDKman. How many people are using SDKman? How many people switch JDKs? Yeah. If you're not switching JDKs, you might not need it. But it's an awesome tool you can do. If you just do SDK install Java, it'll actually do the latest and greatest version of Java 21. You can use it to install Gradle, SDK install Gradle, Maven, basically all of the SDKs that we have in the Java ecosystem. I love it. I use it all the time. You can even use it to install GraalVM. And so Java 21 represents the 12th feature release as part of a 6-month cadence, right? So we've been doing this 6 months for a while now. And for over 6 years, this level of predictability has really helped and allowed developers to more easily manage their adoption of the innovation that's coming out. And what I like to think of it as, it's like a train station, right? And the train leaves every 6 months. And you can get on or you can wait for the next one. And the whole LTS thing, right, the long-term support is really an Oracle thing that everyone else has adopted. And if you ever see anything that says you have to pay for Java to use in production, that's only if you use Oracle's JDK. So whoever says that is absolutely wrong. And me and a lot of the Java champions have been trying to get them to not say that. I noticed a InfoWorld article today that says that, and it's like, no, if you use Oracle's JDK, you might have to pay for production, but there's Azul's JDK, there's Amazon's JDK, there's all kinds of JDKs that you don't have to pay to use in production. And of course, you can buy support, and if you're running $1 billion business, maybe you want some support. So that's just trying to clear up some confusion there. So this whole presentation started way back when I helped publish this blog post. So this is 2020, this is before COVID's hit, and it's basically a pretty simple blog post just showing you how to develop REST APIs with Spring Boot, Quarkus, and Micronaut. And it was such a hit that I was like, well, what if I just took that and improvised on it? So I wrote one the next year in 2021 on how to use those same frameworks to build native Java REST APIs. So this is using GraalVM to compile them and see how they perform. And then the people from Oracle contacted me, and they were like, what about Helidon? And I'm like, well, to be honest, Helidon's not on my radar. But to be fair, I will add it to my comparison. So that's how Helidon got in here. That was in 2022. And so you might be wondering, when you're talking about GraalVM and you're talking about native Java REST APIs, a lot of times you're talking about startup time. Otherwise, you just use the JVM, and who cares about startup time? But serverless is just someone else's computer, right? Can't you get around these issues by leaving your JVM warm? And the truth is yes. But with pay per usage, it costs money to leave them running. And so if you have serverless, you can save big companies a lot of money. If you're spending, let's say, $500 million on your cloud bill, right? And you stop those services when you're not using them, maybe your cloud bill goes down to $400 million, right? $100 million, pretty big savings. So big companies, they just don't want money flying out the window, right? So that's one of the biggest reasons for GraalVM native Java REST APIs. And Dan Vega did a really good job here basically talking about use cases for native images. The JVM is likely better for a high traffic website, huge memory and CPU consumption, frequent deployments, and then you get down to the bottom there for recommended. If you need low memory and CPU, you don't want to pay for a big EC2 instance, you want their micro instance, or function as a service, right? Or scale to 0 where, it is serverless and only starts when someone hits it. And so those are kind of the reasons behind GraalVM, and a lot of times I do this talk, people are like, do I need it? And chances are, reference this slide or this tweet from Dan, and chances are, maybe you don't. But if you really want to start things fast and compete with Python and Node, who are kind of eating Java's lunch in the serverless world, then I would definitely consider it. And there's a cool thing that's going on right now in the Java ecosystem, I think it's the 1 billion row challenge, where they're trying to make Java as fast as possible to process 1 billion rows, and they've got it down to a second, and all of those are done with GraalVM. So even though the JVM is fast, GraalVM is typically faster. So to get started with Micronaut, I recommend SDKman, as I did in the beginning. You can install their CLI using SDK install Micronaut, and then you can create an app like this. And in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create what's called an OAuth resource server. So a resource server is just an API, and if you hit that endpoint of that API, you're not going to be redirected to log in. It's just going to give you back a 401. If you hit that API with an access token and it's valid, it will log you in. So that's all I'm building here. I'm going to build a hello endpoint that just returns the user's name, and the only way to access is it with an access token. So that's why I have the security-JWT as a dependency here. The version I'm using is 4.2.3. So it is possible there's a newer version that came out, but it's probably just a minor release, so not a big deal, or a patch release. So this launch is an alternative to the command line that you saw earlier. So if you're more of a visual person, you want a UI, go to micronaut.io/launch. And then I chose all the similar defaults. The interesting thing here is in the last version, I think they're on Micronaut 4, and it might have been between Micronaut 4.1 and 4.2. They changed to Gradle Kotlin as the default build tool. And that's the first of any of these frameworks that I've seen convert to Gradle Kotlin as a default. Spring Boot changed to Gradle as a default with their 3.x version. And so Helidon is still Maven only, doesn't even have a Gradle component, but that's interesting to see the different build tools. And then you can develop a hello endpoint that returns the user's name using this code here. So from a lines of code perspective, a little lengthy, right? A lot of imports. But then to configure the JWT security, all you need to give it is a JSON web key set that contains the public keys that can be used to verify the signature of the JWT. So that's this URL I'm using right here. And then keys are used to validate the JWT and authorize access tokens. You've probably seen a JWT before. It's got a header, claims, and a signature there. And then what I typically use is HTTPy to test the endpoints. You might use curl, you might use Postman. How many people use HTTPy or have heard of it? Oh, wow. We got one in the back, 2 of them. All right, so here's a little animated GIF. You just do HTTP. You can use HTTPS as well. And it gives like color coding, allows you to put, patch all the different verbs. And you don't have to specify like application JSON as a content type. So it's a pretty cool tool. So to test this Micronaut app that we just built, you can do Gradle run, hit HTTP 8080 hello. It'll give you a 401, and then you specify an access token. Try it again with that authorization header, and it will work. And here's proof. So you can see this is January 9th, so I did it last week, so that's why I didn't get the latest version, if there is a latest version of Micronaut. But you can see this is testing it, getting the 401, specifying the token, and then it returns the username down here. So this is Auth0 specific like username. If you used Okta's, has a workforce identity component as well, and theirs returns an email. So it depends on your IDP, your identity provider, what it returns for the subclaim. That's what's happening here. And if we logged in with Google, instead of logging in with username and password, this prefix would change to like Google-OAuth2. So that's how Auth0 distinguishes how you logged in. So to get started with Quarkus, very similar. Quarkus create app, specify the package name and the app name, and then smallRye JWT is their thing to process JWTs, and rest easy reactive. And I get this question all the time. People are like, why reactive? We're building a non-reactive app. And I've gone back and forth with the Quarkus guys about this. Basically, if you use rest easy classic, so that's just rest easy, I think, no dash reactive, it's for Java EE servers. If you're going to deploy in WebSphere, I'm sorry, but you have to use the non-reactive version. This reactive version works for both reactive and non-reactive apps. So that's what they recommend by default, even if you're doing non-reactive apps. And then I specify Gradle here because Maven's the default, and I wanted to do them all in Gradle. You can also use a Maven archetype. So not easy to remember, right? This is almost possible to remember. That's not easy to remember. Or you can use a UI at code.quarkus.io, and rest easy reactive is by default if you create a new app. So that's pretty cool. Their code, you might notice, there's a bunch of Jakarta imports in here. So this is microprofile compliant. And Helidon and Quarkus are microprofile compliant. The other two, Spring Boot and Micronaut, are not. So a little more code here for getting the security principal and returning it, but not too bad. And then for microprofile JWT security, they actually have a spec for it, and they only have 2 properties. So there's an issuer and then a public key location. And part of me is like, really? Like, you can look up the public key location from the issuer. if you go to the OpenID configuration endpoint there, it's at .wellknown/OpenID configuration. It's got that JWKS URL in there. So the only reason I configure that they require that is for speed, right? They don't have to look up from the issuer if they already have that JWKS URI. I've also talked to the Quarkus folks, and they're like, if you use the OIDC extension instead of the JWT extension, then we do that for you. So that's one workaround too. And then you can start it up with Gradle here, run it just like we did with Micronaut, and you can see, unauthorized looks pretty similar to the other one. So to get started with Spring Boot, there's a SDK-man install Spring Boot, so you can do that. But I'm using HTTPy here because the start.spring.io has a REST API as well. So you can hit it, pass in parameters, and you actually get the version or a demo.zip that downloads. So the interesting thing here is you might notice this is the first one I've specified the version in. And that's because it's actually broken in Spring Boot 3.2.1. And it won't be fixed until February 19th, next version of Spring Boot. And when I say broken, I just mean web, security, and GraalVM. If you develop an app with web and Spring Security, you're not going to see any issues. If you try to compile it with GraalVM, it doesn't work. I found the issue. I linked to it at the end of the slides. And so the worst part is if you go to start.spring.io, you can't even choose 3.2.0. So you'll have to download it, and then you'll have to go and change it to 3.2.0, instead of 3.2.1. So that's, again, if you're using these dependencies, web, OAuth2 resource server, and GraalVM support. And what I found developing this presentation and keeping it updated over the years, I always find a bug with one of the frameworks every time I update it. So this time I found two, one in Spring Boot and one in Helidon. And like I said, you can also use SDK-man. So here's a command for that. You install Spring Boot and then Spring init, specify those dependencies, the group ID, package name, all that. And they win for the least amount of code required, right? But you got to think, Spring Boot's been around since 2014. A lot of these other frameworks came out like 5 years later, right? So they've had a lot of time to refine like their annotations and stuff. They used to require a lot more, and now they've gotten less, so you just need the REST controller there and the get mapping, and then return the principal name. And we also have an Okta Spring Boot starter that you can use that works with Auth0 and Okta. And so it's cool because you can actually memorize the property names. The alternative for this, if you're just using Spring Security, is spring.security.auth2.resourceserver.jwt.issuer-URI. It's much easier to remember okta.auth2.issuer. So that's the only reason I mention it. It's basically a thin wrapper on top of Spring Security, and it includes the resource server and the OAuth client. And it does audience validation, which Spring Boot or Spring Security doesn't do by default. So again, HTTPIE looks the same. But the difference is, look at these security headers. None of the other frameworks had security headers like that. So Spring Security is doing a lot better in returning all those security headers, even though it's just a 401. And then if you pass in a valid token, you still get all those security headers, and you get, the result you're looking for. So to get started with Helidon, at first they just had an archetype. And that was like, look at that. There's no way you're memorizing that, right? The latest version is 4.0.3. I think that came out this week, so I'm 0.1 behind. Hopefully they fixed the bug I found. But they also have a UI, so this is at helidon.io/starter. And you can select MP or SE. So SE is like the reactive version. And I do have a sample app that someone contributed to a presentation that I'm doing at JFocus next month that uses SE, but right now we're just doing microprofile, and then you select the dependencies you like and stuff like that. Or you can use the Helidon CLI. So this is new in the last couple months, where they've actually put it on SDK-man, and it's pretty simple there. You can specify the flavor, the group ID, all that kind of stuff. And then they are also using microprofile, right? That's the Jakarta imports there. And then they have some of their own for the security portion. But they also require another class. So of all the frameworks, no one else requires you register the resource like Helidon does. So that's a little different. But the JWT security, you can't add it when you actually create the app like you can with the other frameworks. But it's an easy dependency to add. And then the microprofile properties look the same. And then HTTP-IE, and testing it with that console. All right, so now you might be wondering, what about startup times? And so this is completely arbitrary. I don't know if this even matters, right? Because what I'm doing here is I'm starting it on my Apple Silicon M1 laptop, right? And that doesn't have anything to do with production, right? Production is probably going to be a cheap Linux box, and it's not going to be an Apple Silicon machine. So this is just kind of on a day-to-day as you're starting things up. So the dark blue is using Gradle or Maven to start things up, and then the light blue is once you've packaged it, doing java-jar to start it up. And the reason I added the second one is because the Quarkus guys were like, you're making us look bad, right? And it's because when you start up a Quarkus app, it actually is monitoring all your files to see if they change. So if you modify a properties file or a Java file or whatever, it'll recompile it and reload the app for you. That's different from Spring Boot. Spring Boot, if you have DevTools installed, will reload it if you recompile. So if you're an Eclipse user, you don't really notice, right? Because every time you save, it recompiles. But in IntelliJ, you have to go in and configure it to recompile on save. So it can be a little different. It gives the best experience from a developer perspective, Quarkus does, because it just works like that. But you can see Dev Startup with Micronaut is the fastest. And then these other ones, Spring Boot and Helidon are pretty close, but the slower ones. And then Quarkus takes a while. But chances are you never have to restart Quarkus throughout the day, because every time you change anything, it reloads itself. And now looking at GraphQL APIs, basically all of them support it. I haven't used it in any of them but Spring Boot, but I imagine they're all pretty similar. They all have documentation, and a lot of it's just setup. And once you have it set up, everything works pretty nice. And one thing to notice is that Spring Boot didn't have official support until I think last year, maybe a year and a half ago. All the rest of them kind of baked it in from the beginning. And Spring actually adopted a project and brought it under the Spring umbrella. So for the longest time, that link would be a non-Spring project, but it's cool now that it's native to the Spring community. And then OAuth is very complicated. And trying to understand it feels like you're lost in a maze of specs, trying to find your way out before you finally do what you actually want to do. And so the main goal of OAuth 2.1 is trying to eliminate a lot of that confusion and capture the current best practices in OAuth 2.0, as well as its established extensions under a single name. So this is still in draft. It hasn't been, finalized yet. Aaron Parecki is a coworker of mine at Okta that works a lot on OAuth, and he runs OAuth.net and OAuth.com. And so this is a lot of his work. You can see here, this is his blog down here where he talks about it. But PKCE, proof key for code exchange, is required for all clients using the authorization code flow. Redirect URIs must be exact. Can't do wildcards in them. The implicit grant came out when basically we didn't have cores in browsing, cross-origin resource sharing. So you would have to actually return like an access token in the browser, right, in the address bar. That's not good because that can end up in server logs. And so that's being removed. The resource owner password credential grant is omitted. And that's another one where if you see a tutorial about OAuth and you see them use password grant and a username and password, they're totally bypassing the whole point of OAuth. So the only reason this resource owner password grant was put in there is because if you couldn't launch a browser, for instance, you're on Windows 3.1 and you still want to use OAuth, right? You can actually use that to talk to an authorization server and get tokens. And then there's a couple other things you can see there. So OAuth is not an authentication protocol. It has nothing to do with authentication. But Spring Boot confuses that because they have an OAuth 2 login as a method name, right, if you're using Spring Security. So really, whenever you're doing authentication in an OAuth capacity, you're doing OpenID Connect. And Facebook and Google and Microsoft and even Okta were a part of this. It's a thin layer on top of OAuth that gives you the ability to log in and gives you an ID token so you can actually know who the person is. Because when you do authorization, like I showed with HTTP-IE, it's just a JWT, and you're lucky if there's anything in there that has identity information, right? Because the sub that I'm printing out there's no identity information in there. All you know is it's an auth0 sub, right? But you could change that if you wanted to. So that's why OpenID Connect comes into play. All of these frameworks have OpenID Connect, and it's actually very easy to use, what I found. So the other thing is, what about testing? Well, no one tests, do they? No, come on, some of you do. The cool thing that I've seen is two things. One, Spring Security's security testing is really cool because it'll allow you to mock out JWTs and users and roles and all that kind of stuff in your test. And when it comes to GraalVM and native stuff, they create a native binary that's just your tests. So you can actually run it in a native environment. And the reason that's important, what I found, is because when I first started playing with a lot of these, you had to explicitly enable HTTPS as part of the GraalVM build. And so you wouldn't notice that the binary isn't going to work till you started it, right? And then it's like, there's no HTTPS support, so I can't talk to the issuer to actually figure out, where your JWKS URI is. So that kind of thing was important for me to learn, to be able to test these things. The even cooler one is Quarkus has a way of annotating your test or subclassing your test and then adding Quarkus integration test, and it'll be a native test then. So it'll test your regular test in a native environment. And so the next thing to talk about is Docker. So of course, with any of these, they produce a jar. So you could put it in a Docker container with this simple Docker file, right? You've already built it. It's in the target directory if you're using Maven. It's in the build directory if you're using Gradle. You copy it into there. You expose 8080. You start it with java-jar. That will work for any of these frameworks. And then you can build it, and then you can run it, and it'll all work really nicely. But there's another tool out there called AJUG from Google that allows you to basically, it reads your build file, and so it can do more with your Docker image and basically make it more robust and not have to worry about maintaining that Docker file. So you can use AJUG build to build it locally or directly to your Docker daemon using AJUG Docker build. And some of these frameworks come with Docker files or AJUG support. So Micronaut uses AJUG, but you must configure a plugin for it. Quarkus generates 4 Docker-related files, and then if you want to use Quarkus with AJUG, you can add it that way. And then Spring Boot 2.3 Plus has native built-in support for Docker. So if you use -p native Spring Boot build image, it'll actually use your Docker to build it, so you don't need GraalVM installed. The problem that I found, at least on this machine, is the Docker way takes like 6 minutes. The GraalVM way takes like 90 seconds. So of course you're going to want the 90-second version, not the 6-minute version, right? But what I've also done in some of my tests is I've built the Docker version with GitHub Actions, right? And published it to my Docker hub. So it's always available there, and I can always test like its performance or whatever without worrying about building it locally. And it uses layer jars for faster builds. So dependencies are first. Those hardly ever change. Snapshot dependencies change a little more. Resources, the properties files and stuff like that change a little more. And then the application itself changes the most. So it caches a lot of those layers. So the build will get faster over time. And then Helidon generates 3 Docker files. Docker file, Docker JLink, and native. And then if you add JIB in the Maven file, you do have to configure it there. Then you can compile it that way. And so to go native with each of these frameworks, with the Micronaut CLI, of course, you can create it, you can package it, and then you can run Gradle native image or Gradle Docker build native if you want to deploy it to your Docker thing running locally. With GraalVM and Quarkus, you can package it that way, use Gradle if you want, build it, run it. And then for Spring Boot, it's the only one that doesn't support GraalVM by default. So all these other ones, when you create an app, you're good to go. With Spring Boot, you do have to add the Maven plugin or the GraalVM plugin. So you might notice when I created all these apps using like the Spring init command or with HTTPS, I did specify that native extension. But the rest of them I didn't have to, right? It was built in. So that's one little difference, but obviously this is pretty easy to do. And you can always go to start.spring.io and select native and click the Explore button, and it will show you the build file, so you can just copy and paste out of that. And then you can build it with native compile -p native, or you can use the Gradle command if you're using Gradle, and then build an image and Docker container. So it brings up a good point. How many people are using Maven? And how many people are using Gradle? It's about half and half, about 50-50. It's interesting because we created a Spring Boot workshop. Remind me at the end to give you a link to that. And it's all Gradle. And the first time we did it was at Devoxx Belgium over in Antwerp in October. And we did two things. We assumed most people are using Mac and Linux, like 80%, and most people would be using Gradle. It was 80% Windows and 90% Maven people. We were like, oh, this is going to be rough. So we know what to improve now in the workshop. So with GraalVM and Helidon, you build it, using those Docker files, and then run it, similar to the other ones. But this is where it gets fun, right? The native startup performance. So this is on my MacBook Pro, M1, time from console. This is very important. This is what the frameworks say they start in. Micronaut, it's the fastest. It starts in 16.2 milliseconds. Quarkus, it's the second fastest, 21.8 milliseconds. And this Micronaut optimized, you see there, is what the Micronaut guys contributed to my repository to say if you use Micronaut AOT ahead of time compiling, it'll be even faster. And the last time I did this, it was. But it ain't that much faster this time, right? Like half a millisecond or whatever. And then we have Spring Boot, right? That's its printed time. We have Helidon with its time, and then Helidon optimized. So Helidon optimized was contributed from the Helidon folks, and they removed OpenAPI. Because when you create a brand new Helidon app, it has OpenAPI in there, which slows up the startup time. So that's their optimized version of Helidon. But when I script it, and I run a script that starts the container and then sees when localhost 8080 is first available, it's way different, right? That's a lot different. And they're very similar, right? So even though these are kind of similar here, you can see that like Micronaut and Quarkus are neck and neck, and Quarkus is just a little bit faster. And what I'm doing here is whenever I run the script or whenever I start and look at everything, I do it 3 times, and then I do it 5 times, and I do the average. So I know it's not a perfect measurement, but it's interesting. And especially because what they're printing out on the console is way different from what's actually happening, right? Micronaut is not starting in 16 seconds. It's starting in a half a second, right? Almost 50 milliseconds. So I thought that was very interesting. And I have the script in the repo that you can look at for that. And the tests were all run on this 2021 MacBook Pro. But I also did some testing on AWS because the Quarkus folks had me on their podcast, and they were like, so we don't really like how you're doing the testing, right? You're doing it on your Apple Silicon machine, and guess what? No one's using those in production, right? So why don't you test on AWS or something that people are using in production? So I did it the naive way at first, and I've deleted most of my slides about this, but I kept this one. And it was just me basically trying these instances of EC2 containers and seeing if I can build, right, these actual projects and just get the native image going. And you can see there, T2 small, I couldn't even build it. T2 medium, failed to build most of them. And then once I got 8 gigs of RAM and 2 virtual CPUs, they all built. But that's a T2 large, right? And you probably don't want to pay for that. And so what I realized was, first of all, even if you're going to do something strange like build your binaries on these machines, you're probably not going to run them as binaries on these machines. You're going to use Docker, right? You're going to package them up in Docker, and then you're going to pull them and run them on these machines. So what I did is I created a GitHub action in this repo there that I'll show you at the end that checks out the code, installs GraalVM, and then builds each one, tags it, and then pushes it to my Docker Hub. So I think this gives a much more real-world scenario. And then I used a script from Micronaut on how to do the Docker startup performance. So this is similar in that the script is running on the machine that it's running the Docker image. So there's probably better ways to do this, right? But you would have to deploy it in a serverless environment. So when you hit it from another machine, it would start up, and then you could see how long that took. But basically, here's Micronaut, Quarkus, Spring Boot, and Helidon. You can see there, Quarkus wins, starts the fastest. And this is the first time I've seen Helidon beat Spring Boot. So that's interesting. And Micronaut, and Quarkus are similar, but in a Docker container, it's a little interesting. And then native memory used after 10 requests. And the reason, when I first started doing this comparison, it was basically I would just start it and see how much memory was being used. And that's not really valid, right? You got to hit it with a request. And so I do 1 request and then 5 requests and see. And what I found with a couple frameworks during these updates was the memory kept growing. Like each request, it would add 10 megabytes. And I reported it to Micronaut, they fixed it. I reported it to Helidon, and they fixed it. But Helidon took like 6 months to fix. So I was like, are you guys not testing this? Or maybe they just allow it to go up to 250 megs and then they stop it? I don't know, but that was very interesting for me. Most of them use around 40 or 50 when they first start, and then it increases with the first request, and then it typically stays around there. So you can see here, Quarkus is only using 50 megabytes, which is awesome for a Java app, right? This is compiled to native, so it's going to be much less than a regular Java app, but you can see they're all, for a Java app, doing pretty well. And then for Docker memory used after 10 requests, it's quite a bit different, right? This is on my M1, and this is on Docker, right? So you can see they're very low consumption on Docker, especially Quarkus and Micronaut there. And so I've shown you most of the code in the demo, but I like to show you the repo. So let's look at that real quick. I've got a mirror, or you won't know what I'm doing, so give me my mouse back. There we go. And then I did compile this before we started, so you can see here, this was at 16 or 1846, right before we started. So I ran the build script in the base of this repository, and we'll open this up in IntelliJ, just so it's light mode and you can see it a little easier. And I could probably change my resolution. Optimize for this one. So you can see it a little better. There's this cool thing that I just discovered. However many people know about Gitpod? So check this out. You can open it in Gitpod, and it'll prompt you for the actual, GitHub URL, VS Code, and if you want 8 or 16 gigs of RAM. And it has everything in here. It's got SDKman installed, it's got Homebrew installed, and you can actually run all your Docker containers and everything. So the reason I mention this is because guess what? Like if I try to run these Docker containers locally and I haven't built them, they aren't going to work because you build it for Linux, right? If I wanted to build them for Mac, sure, that's fine locally, but my GitHub Actions actually does it for Linux. So let's look at that real quick. That's up here in GitHub Workflows Docker. So it sets up GraalVM, right? It builds each one just using their Gradle commands or whatnot and the Docker tag, and then logs into Docker Hub here, and then it publishes them, right? So if you go to mrable/Micronaut, mrable/Quarkus, you can get those Docker containers. And if I try to run it locally here, I have this script, right, that starts up Docker and looks for the first time that localhost 8080 is available. So if I do start Docker mrable Quarkus, it'll probably error out. Right. The requested platform does not match, right? So if I wanted to rebuild the Docker containers locally each time, that would work. But the cool thing is in Gitpod here, I can actually do that same thing. Cancel that. Grammarly, stop it. Get out of there. And then I can do like start Docker mrable Quarkus. And so if it hasn't downloaded it, which it hasn't, right, it pulls it, and then it starts it, and then it prints out the time. So that's how I got all those numbers, and it's just cool that this environment like exists, right? And you can see there, look, it started in 0.21 seconds. And so if I was to leave it running, it does prompt me to open up. You saw that 8080 real quick there, and it basically exposes the ports for you. So if you start any Docker container, it'll actually expose the ports and make it easy for you to use. So that's why I like it. It's cool. I can run all these scripts, and there's a Docker thing down here that'll show your images if you started any of them. I can actually go to here, and there's this Docker Compose that has them all in there. And so if I just did Docker Compose up, it'll pull the ones it hasn't. So I think this is a great thing if you're ever doing workshops, right? Because people don't have to set up their local environment. They can just like use this in the cloud. It starts them all up. It'll prompt me to make them public. And then if I look at the Docker tab here, it shows all those running. And if I look at the ports, it shows the different ports that they're running on, right? And they don't have a UI, but I could hit these with an access token and do the same thing I was doing earlier. So let's, we can just open this one. It'll give us a 401, right? This is the Micronaut version, and if I create a new access token with auth0 test token, specify my audience, it'll give me an access token once I log in here. And then what was that URL? That's the URL. We can take this token. We can take HTTP, hit this URL, hello, and authorization, bearer, and this right here. And it actually works, right? So I'm talking to that cloud instance. I could run them locally too. And I do have them built locally, right? So if I were to do like Micronaut, oh, the hard part is remembering where they put them. So I have that in the README. So it's like, it's this, where is it? This is where the app ends up with Micronaut, right? So if I was to run that locally, cd Micronaut, clear, you can see it starting in 23 milliseconds, right? If I try it again, 16 milliseconds, 15 milliseconds. But if I do start, which is the scripted version, start, nope, it's up one level. It's not 20 milliseconds. It's 57 milliseconds, right? So it's fun to see that difference, especially 12 milliseconds, no, 50 milliseconds. Try it again. 12 milliseconds, no, 45 milliseconds. So frameworks are filthy liars, that's all I can say. But, you know, at the same time, maybe they don't know when it started. I don't know. So that whole repo is at github.com, Octadev, auth0, Java, REST, API, examples. And so to run everything, it's in this README here. You can open it in Gitpod, but you can clone it. You can install GraalVM. You'll need a free auth0 developer account if you want to do the access token stuff. You can easily configure it to use your own identity provider. All the configuration is just in these properties files for each one. And then I'm doing a reactive version of this, comparing reactive to the regular imperative. And that one I haven't released yet or talked about yet, but it's right here. And there's reactive versions of each one, and they do the same thing. But the real question is reactive faster, both on the JVM and as native? So I still need to figure that out. I haven't run the tests against it yet. So any questions at this point?
Are you also going to do native threads? JDK21 threads?
So it's interesting. If you go to, so the question was, are you going to do virtual threads in the reactive versus imperative comparison? And so in this reactive examples, there is one closed repo. No, there was a, maybe I just did. Yes, I did. So In 2 of the frameworks, you can do virtual threads. No, I don't see it. But so Micronaut detects if you're in a Java 21 environment and will enable virtual threads. Quarkus requires an annotation on the method that you want to do virtual threads with. Spring requires a property in your application.properties file. And then Helidon is virtual threads by default. So they will be there in my comparison because actually I think it was in the Java REST one. So Java REST API examples, that's where I enabled virtual threads. So if you go here, enable virtual threads, you can see I only had to do it on 2 of them, right? So this is Quarkus, right, run on virtual thread, and then Spring Boot has spring.threads.virtual.enabled. And the other 2 claim that they do it by default, and Micronaut also doesn't have a reactive flavor. They just enable reactive. I don't know. Like, it's one of those things that I talked to them on this pull request here. Let's see, pull 58. And those are my issues were. So I said, oh no, that wasn't this one. I did talk to them, and they were like, no, it should work, right? Like, there is no reactive flavor, but it can do reactive, whatever that means. So I'm looking forward to running all the tests and figuring out like which one's faster, but I also think like reactive versus imperative might make a difference on the JVM, but does it really make a difference when you're native, right? Because I think when you're native, it might erase some of those JVM abilities where you're blocking versus non-blocking. We'll see. I'm doing that next month at JFocus in Sweden, so we'll find out then. What's that? The before one? Yeah, grab that URL if you want to look at these examples or run them in Gitpod. You had a question?
Are you also the Matt Rabel that created JHipster?
So I am not the Matt Rabel that created JHipster. I am the Matt Rabel that contributes to JHipster. Okay. So I started a project called AppFuse way back in 2004, and Julian Dubois, who started JHipster, gives me credit as the grandfather of JHipster because of AppFuse. But yeah, I do work on it.
Cool. It's a cool project. Thanks.
Thank you.
So I wanted to know with the new Java crack feature, do you think it will have any effect on the startup time for this, like, or would it even matter?
Yeah, absolutely. I forget what crack stands for. It's CRAC, but it basically allows you to save the state of your current app and then restart it in that state. And it started from Azul. They were the first ones that put it in their JDK, but I think it's an open JDK now. So it's very much a competitor to like Graal VM, and it being like we run it as native binary and we start fast because it's on the JVM. And if you're doing serverless and you can still use the JVM, that's pretty cool, right? Because the JVM will optimize itself over time versus native threads or a native application won't. Great question. Well, if you have questions, raise your hand. I'll try to get to you as I non-mirror this thing. I think that was my last demo. Okay. So this is what I like to call pretty graphs, because a lot of times comparing these communities and their ecosystem isn't really fair when it comes to Spring Boot. Because guess what? Spring Boot 1.0 was released on April Fool's Day in 2014. So I think they might have taken a tip from Gmail, because Gmail did the same thing. They released on April Fool's Day as like, I don't know what kind of joke it is, but it's been around for a long time, right? Now we're in 2024. It's been 10 years. And Micronaut 1.0 was October 23rd, 2018, right? So they've only been around 6 years. Quarkus 1.0 was November 2019. It's kind of funny they were a year after Micronaut, but they caught up. And then Helidon was February 2019. So everyone's about 5 years old now. But again, Spring Boot, 10 years old. So when it comes to Stack Overflow tags, most people have problems with Spring Boot. That's one way of looking at it, right? But no, really, I think that Stack Overflow is the new like mailing list. I used to do a talk similar to this way back in 2004. I actually did it for 10 years, from 2004 to 2014. It was called Comparing Java Web Frameworks, right? And when I first did that talk, it was 2004, and the Wicket guys, you all know Wicket in the Java community, right? And Struts were like two of the leaders, right? And so I'm like, look at the mailing list traffic for Struts. And the Wicket guys are like, that's because people have so many problems with it, right? 2 years later, I'm doing the same talk over in Amsterdam. Guess who's leading? Wicket. And the guys are in the audience. I'm like, do you still think it's because everyone has problems with your framework? They're like, no, it's the ecosystem. So I think this is like a representation of the community, right? Most people are using Spring Boot. And people are asking questions about the other ones. But to be honest, like Helidon is not growing at all. I don't know if this is because all the questions are on Oracle's forums or whatever. But it's also interesting that Oracle is contributing heavily to both Micronaut and Helidon. So they have committers that they've hired that work on both of them. But since the last time I did this presentation, which was October in New York City, Helidon's had 11 questions. So that's like 3 months, right? And I didn't record the other ones because they were a lot more. GitHub stars. Since October, Micronaut is up 100, Quarkus is up 300, Spring Boot's up 1,500, and Helidon's up 100. So that just shows the growth there is still with Spring Boot, even though the other ones have some representation. I mean, if I started an open source project and it had 5,000 stars or 3,000, I'd be pretty happy with it. But I didn't start JHipster. It does have 20,000, so it's kind of crazy that the others don't. The star growth, right? This is Spring Boot here. You can see it's still growing faster than the others. So these have dented it, right? But the pink one is Helidon down there. It's not growing as much. And then Micronaut, and then Quarkus has a little more upward momentum. Jobs on Indeed in the US. Learn Spring Boot if you want a job. That's what this says. And it's interesting. So since October, Micronaut is up 4. Quarkus is down 25%. So that's only 12, right? Spring Boot is down 500, and Helidon doubled. So it doesn't mean much when you double from 14 to 28, but still, it's on there, right? MicroProfile has 2. So don't invest your time in MicroProfile if you want a job. That's what that says to me, right? But Java is at 39,000, so lots of Java jobs. It is down 2,500 since October. JavaScript is 33,000, so we're beating JavaScript, yay. But it's also down 2,100. And then Kotlin is only at 1,800. So I don't know if Kotlin's going to get you a job either, but it's the only one that's up 200 out of the 3 languages, so it has increased. Twitter followers, I refuse to call it X. You can see here, Spring Boot's doing the best, but even Helidon has quite a few. Micronaut hasn't had any new followers since October. Quarkus has 300 more, and Spring Boot has 1,400, and even Helidon is up 215, so I don't know what Micronaut's up to, but speaking of JHipster, we do have Spring Boot 3 in JHipster 8. We also have a Micronaut blueprint, and we have a Quarkus blueprint. So if you want either of those backends, you can use them. We're crazy too because we even have a Node.js backend and a .NET backend blueprint if you want to use those. So what I like to talk about is what I found this time. And because I always find stuff whenever I update this presentation, right? So the first thing was when I was on the EC2 instance trying to do the Docker timings, I found that for some reason the Quarkus image was like locked. And so even though my GitHub action was deploying a new Docker image, I wasn't getting it when I was running the test. So I had to use Docker image and then Docker RMI image ID and force the deletion of it. So if I didn't know that or there wasn't an error in my existing Docker image, I would have taken the old one and like used it. So that's something cool about Gitpod is it will initialize a new environment so you won't have any Docker containers laying around. But on my EC2 instance, I did have to forcibly remove that. The optimized Micronaut version is slower than the optimized version. That's weird. And I did have a couple committers like comment on it, but they didn't give me a solution. So I think for the reactive version, there's no reason to do an optimized version if it's not faster. The Spring Boot 3.2.1 doesn't work with GraalVM when using Web Plus security. So I think I can click on that, show you the issue. And if you download the slides, I'll give you a link at the end. You'll see that. So this is pull 58 on my repo. And then there's a bug in Spring Security. Oh, sorry. Hate it when that happens. Glad you told me. This is the issue. It's Spring Security 14362. And you can see here I said, you know, if this fix will be available, I'm doing a presentation. Nope, February 19th. So otherwise, you can use a snapshot version of Spring Security if you want. But I recommend if you're doing Spring, Web, Crawl VM, Security, just use 3.2.0. And then Helidon needs this add all car sets to its properties, or else you get a weird thing about a specific language not found. And then the fun one I put in there, hopefully this gets some people mad on the internet. The frameworks are filthy liars when it comes to printed startup times. So my thoughts, I think Quarkus provides the best developer joy and memory usage. And when I started doing this presentation a couple years ago, Micronaut was number one. And it has, they've kind of gone back and forth between, major releases. One of the funny things that I had happen last spring was I found, and it was just the printed startup times. It wasn't the scripted fancy stuff that the Quarkus guys talked me into. Quarkus was 1/3 slower than it was in a dot release before it. And so I was like, this is weird because, why did it go up 10 milliseconds when it was 25 milliseconds before and now it's 35? So I contacted them, told them about it, and they fixed it, and it was real. So it's always funny when some guy is just putting together these simple apps and they're finding things that the framework people aren't with their, probably extensive CI tests. Spring Boot, strongest community ecosystem and growth. If you're going to learn any of these, start with Spring Boot if you're brand new to Java because there's so much documentation. There's so much good backwards compatibility that even though there's a tutorial that's 3 years old, it probably still works. I can't say that for the other frameworks. And then Helidon has been competitive with Spring Boot, but it's just not very popular. And I really didn't think it was competitive until recently, till I started doing those scripted things, because before just the startup times were way different, right? And turns out they're all lying. So if you're new to Java, try Spring Boot. If you know Spring and you want to try any of the other ones out, they all have Spring to Quarkus or Spring to Micronaut documentation. Testing is important. I didn't mean to say no one tests. Invest early and often. Design your apps with security in mind and use OpenID Connect and OAuth 2.1. You can find many tutorials and many resources on developer.auth0.com. We call that our developer center. There's also developer.okta.com. And even though it started as two companies, now we're one. And Okta does workforce, so they do identity for employees and partners of a company. And Auth0 is more for you're developing a consumer app or a SaaS app, right? So that's why you might use one or the other. And our handles at OktaDev on GitHub, on YouTube, on Twitter. And if you want to sign up for a free account, you can try us for free. We give you 7,500 monthly active users, unlimited logins. We have passkey support, so we hope to get rid of passwords altogether. Passkeys is pretty cool. No credit card, and I think you'll like it. You can also subscribe to our Zero Index newsletter. There's a QR code for that URL, and then we'll send you monthly spam. No, it's not spam. It's actually good, right? There are articles, there are videos, and stuff like that. But more than anything, I get credit for the Java team if you sign up for this. And there's only 2 of us on it, right? And we're competing with a 5-person JavaScript team. So you don't have to stay signed up for it for longer than a week. Just sign up for it, right? And then unsubscribe next month. And use the source, right? Here's where all the sources at oktadev/auth0 Java REST API examples. I encourage you to try it out yourself, right? If you're on Windows or on your Linux, you want to see what those startup times are like, maybe they're different. Or you want to try it out on Gitpod. You can do it there as well. And the cool thing about Gitpod is you don't have to build everything, right? Those Docker images are already available in my GitHub, and you can use it. But if you wanted to create an API token, right, you're going to want to change those properties to match your Auth0 tenant. So may the auth be with you. I have some stickers in the back that I don't know if there's any of these yet left, but there was a minute ago. And if you want to keep in touch, you can find me on my website, rabeldesigns.com. My DNS provider killed my DNS today, so I only learned this like this morning. You can't actually go to rabeldesigns.com. And if you send me an email there, I'm not going to get it either. So hopefully I get that fixed soon. mrabel on Twitter. Speaker Deck, this is actually already up there on Speaker Deck. So if you go to speakerdeck.com/mrabel, it's there. I'll tweet it out, and I'll put it on the meetup page, so you don't have to capture it if you don't want to. And then all my code these days is on Octadev. So any questions?
In the what I found this time slide,
Yeah.
I think the second bullet point. So the optimized Micronaut version is slower than the, what is the other optimized version? The second optimized?
Right. You're right. Let's fix that, right? Then the non.
Oh, the non-optimized. Oh. Thank you.
Good catch.
Quick question. Out of curiosity, was Drop Wizard a consideration of a runtime to test, or did it just not meet the requirements to use at all? Or have you heard of Drop Wizard?
So I've heard of Drop Wizard, and it's actually the grandfather of all of these, right? It was the first one that was like, let's put Tomcat in the jar so you can just java-jar, right? Spring Boot copied it. The rest of them copied Spring Boot. To me, it's kind of like Helidon, where I think if I added it, it would look bad, right? Because especially when it comes to community stuff, they just don't have a lot of activity, I think, anymore. But yeah, I've heard of it, and people that use it love it, but I think a lot of it was because they were the early innovator, right? You use it and you love it? Cool. And it's still being maintained, right? Nice. Are we good? And we're going out for beers, and Octa's buying, so if anyone wants to come along. Yeah? If you're a customer, I'll buy you a steak.
Thanks, Matt. Is this on? Thanks a lot, man. Thanks for coming, Chris. Thanks again as well for that awesome presentation on Backstage. So give it up for these people. Come on.